All right. Well, how's everybody doing? Yeah? Woo! Yeah, it's pretty good, right? Lots of good energy, lots of good ideas. Hopefully those panels are closing down. Are we ready to get going? We're going to get going. Okay. So, 2030 is around the corner. That's just 11 years from now. And by then, it's projected that our global population will grow to 8.6 billion people. That's an additional 1 billion people in the next 11 years, or the equivalent of quadrupling the size of the United States. So, as we prepare for the culmination of this event, let's commit to remembering the vast number of people on this planet who are depending upon the actions of everyone in this room to enjoy a safe and sustainable future. You know, this conference has felt different to me somehow. Maybe it's the fact that you've shared your personal stories, or maybe it's a sense of urgency, or maybe it's both. But I really believe that we've built a new sense of momentum. So when you leave here today, I encourage you, as Hank Oving said in the morning plenary, to put your money where your heart is. When I leave here, I'm going home to celebrate my daughter's 11th birthday tomorrow. And honestly, it seems like just yesterday that she was born. 11 years is not very much time, and it will go by very, very quickly, trust me. We have a lot of work to do to get us there, and I'm confident that we will get there. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for your level of engagement with us over the last few days. As many of us have said over time, it takes a village, and this is an awesome village to be a part of. And so now, for our final plenary. On the stage, we will have leaders from companies that are iconic. There are companies that all of us know and love in many ways. They'll engage in a conversation about how they and others can use their brand power to affect behavioral change, to create social movements, and to maintain a strong bottom line. I'd like now to introduce and welcome our closing panel to the stage. And to moderate this session is Ceres' own Vice President of Government Relations, Ann Kelly.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Don, and it's so great to see all of you here. A special warm welcome to members of the San Francisco community who are joining us for this important conversation about what happens when a brand takes a stand. What happens to their customers? How do their investors feel? How does the CEO sleep at night? We're going to talk about all the social issues that have emerged over this past year, and we're going to talk policy and politics, so hold on to your seats, remembering that Ceres is a bipartisan organization. We're actually post-partisan, which is why I was able to find a jacket that is red, blue, and purple, so that's why I'm wearing that today. So let me start out by introducing our incredible panelists, and then we'll get right at it. Okay, so let me start with you, Alex. Alex Thompson is Vice President of Brand Stewardship and Impact for REI. He's tasked with building long-term brand equity for the nation's largest consumer cooperative. Through communications, public policy, government affairs, sustainability, and philanthropy, Alex helps REI to lead with its values. His team's work involves engaging 12,000 employees in 154 stores, working closely with 300 nonprofits, advancing sustainable business practices, and inspiring 17 million REI members to pursue and enjoy life outdoors through initiatives including #OptOutside. Before joining REI, Alex specialized in international communications and marketing in the for-profit, not-for-profit, and public sectors. He served for more than a decade at Edelman in various roles on 3 continents, and he serves on the board of the Washington Environmental Council. Welcome to you, Alex.
you.
And next to Alex is Kelly McGinnis. As Chief Communications Officer at Levis Strauss & Company, Kelly McGinnis is responsible for managing the global corporate affairs function at the 160-year-old apparel company. In this capacity, she oversees corporate media relations, executive, internal, and stakeholder communications, government affairs, social responsibility, and community affairs. Kelly reports to CEO Chip Berg. Kelly is a 2-time Silver Anvil Award recipient. Look it up, that means she knows her stuff when it comes to PR. She holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Washington and a bachelor's from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And a warm welcome to you, Kelly. And finally, to my immediate left is John Kotcher. John Kotcher is a PhD. He's a research assistant professor at George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication, where he conducts research on science, environmental, and risk communication. His work focuses on how people respond to public engagement by scientists, how to effectively communicate about the public health implications of climate change and air pollution, and how civic organizations can most effectively recruit, organize, and mobilize citizens, especially political conservatives, to demand action on climate change. John also works on the Climate Change in the American Mind project, a series of national public opinion surveys carried out in partnership with the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication to investigate and track public attitudes towards climate change and support for climate policies in the US. John, a welcome to you.
Thank you.
All right, so we're just going to look at a few examples to kick us off, and I know all of these will be familiar to you, just to kick off our conversation. The first one is from Levi's, and I'm excited about Kelly talking about their latest campaign to encourage voting. And of course, Alex will be talking about many of the outdoor campaigns. This one is about the diversity of the outdoor community. They've had wonderful campaigns on public lands and opt outside, which you're going to hear more about. This one is a little less subtle from Patagonia. Some of you recall when the administration was seeking to eliminate public lands. And so this was the campaign, and I'm sure it is familiar to all of you. This one, the best a man can get, Gillette. I will hope you'll look at this and give it a like personally, but we'll talk about whether or not this went over well and what were the elements of that as we look at authenticity of one's message. This, you may remember, was in the Super Bowl. How we would have longed 5 years ago to have a commercial in the Super Bowl that actually promoted wind and attached it to beer. What could be better? And this one is familiar to all of you. Thanks to all of you for wearing the brand, by the way, throughout this whole conference. We are still in. This was one of the easiest campaigns we ever launched, and we'll talk about that. Why was it so reflexive and so easy that hundreds of companies immediately jumped on to We Are Still In when we co-founded this campaign with our good friends at World Wildlife Fund? This is from Mars. Some of you have seen Fans of Wind, the friendly fat M&M peanut and the chocolate M&M telling you about wind. What could be better? What could be more friendly? Mars, as you know, is a very conservative company. Our good friend Brad Feigl, lifetime Republican, was the fellow who had the idea of BICEP. He's at Mars. Worth looking at their campaign. And this one, of course, needs no explanation. You're very familiar with Colin Kaepernick ad by our friends at Nike. So this just gives you a flavor of what's out there and what we've seen just over this past year. Alex, I want to start with you if I could. And I'm just interested in, given your 17 million members, and I know that they span the political spectrum, just talk to us a little bit about REI's positioning on when you decide to weigh in and how, what your overall philosophy is about taking a stand.
I'm more than happy to do that. I think it's interesting when you're in a room like this, people are like sitting there, and people like Kelly and me, and we're involved in these choices. And what they don't know is we just shut ourselves in a dark room. We have a special set of dice, just like fling them against the wall.
Now we know. Well, I guess we're about done, then we can just finish.
I think that's kind of what some of our employees think from time to time. It's like, is there thorough, rigor? And I can get into the process by which that happens, but of course, with an organization like REI, I think it's a bit easier than it can be for other organizations because the central premise that life outside, the broadest possible concept that applies both to individuals and at a planetary level, is a thing that essentially we exist for.
Yeah.
So the decision-making criteria for us always led us to the same question, and it is boiled down in its simplest form to, is this either going to halt what we describe as a long march indoors that human beings have been on for about the last 10,000 years, or is it not? And the statistic that keeps me coming back to these questions of what can an organization do is that somewhere around the year 2000, the majority of human beings started living the majority of their lives inside. But by now in the US, the average American spends approximately 70 years indoors. That's 7-0, based on average life expectancy. That of course includes sleep, but it's about 95% of the time we spend. That data, in fact, came from research that looks at people's exposure to particulates.
Yeah.
But the central question is really kind of what we ask ourselves, is this going to halt this very frightening trend?
Okay, I want to read for the audience something. You have a United Outside manifesto, and I'm quoting, but I'm paraphrasing it here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are equal outside, that there is mirth in mud, catharsis in rain, that the thirst for nature knows no party line. Man, Teddy Roosevelt and Rachel Carson would love that.
There's a line
partisan-
later in that piece that's
Yeah.
like, something like politicians sling mud. I don't know who wrote that line.
I
but
left that
loved
part
it.
out on purpose.
But
I saw that, yeah.
so that was a campaign called United Outside. 2016, we opened a flagship store in DC under the banner left side, right side, United Outside. We held 100 events over 100 days, bringing people together. The supposition was that staffers on the Hill needed a bit of a break, so we threw outdoor parties, gave them beer, stand-up paddle boards and weird things like that, and made them do stuff together. But they loved it. And the principle for REI that the outdoors is a place that uniquely brings people together underpins all of our advocacy efforts. So we are pretty vocal on any number of topics, and we are very comfortable being vocal on issues without being party political. And that's not because we're scared of the backlash. It is that in the bylaws of the co-op, we're a cooperative owned by our members, we are not allowed to endorse one or other party. We are allowed to and encouraged to, in fact measured by the degree to which we drive net positive change for society. And that's just part of the governance structure of the co-op.
Sure. Talk a little more about your public lands campaign, and it resulted in a real legislative success, in fact, a bipartisan success, and I'm not sure our audience knows about.
Yeah, there are two pieces to that I'll mention. So the first is, it's interesting you show the Patagonia campaign. I mean, we were working hand in hand with 500 companies, spanning large organizations like REI, the North Face, Patagonia, and others, and much smaller organizations that do spanning the political spectrum. And this was 2 or 3 years ago now, and it was the defense of our national monuments.
Yeah.
This was one example of how we saw the entire outdoor industry mobilize in a way that they hadn't before, and articulating a single view of the right, essentially, of Americans to roam in our public lands. Now, that's 2 or 3 years ago. Most recently, and only in the last couple of months, a huge piece of legislation has been passed, 600 pages of legislation that was brought forward by Maria Cantwell of Washington State and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. And the bill passed through both houses with incredible bipartisan support. And you know, as the policy director of Ceres, more about the contents of that than I do. But you can think about permanent reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and a great deal of much more localized changes. This is a big example that progress can be made when businesses just get out of their own way and say, listen, we need this, let's work together, and it needn't be a mudslinging match on the journey to that. So it was pretty exciting development.
Really exciting, and congrats. Now I have to ask you about something that's a little more controversial, Proposition 1631 in Washington. I think our audience knows that was the carbon tax proposition. It was referred to earlier by Fawn Sharp of the Quinault Nation. This was a big deal to stand up as a company for a carbon tax in Washington State. Talk about that process, what that was like for you, and how your members reacted.
So I'll leave the dice bit behind, but it was a bit of a throw of the dice, that one, seriously, because, 1631 was a ballot initiative. We didn't receive much pushback from our members as a result of our advocacy. that either means that people don't read voter pamphlets because our logo was on it, or that they, generally speaking, members were supportive of our advocacy there. But I'll say a few words on that. It was a really depressing defeat at the time. But just in the last 2 weeks, Washington State has passed a bill. It's signed into law now that we're on the path to 100% clean energy by 2045, as many of people in the room now here will know. And my view is that that is a direct result of the momentum that was built by the coalition that was focused on 1631. So I'm feeling buoyed by the momentum that's there. I'm also pretty amazed by the degree of support that was that 1631 attracted. I did speak to the campaign director kind of a couple hours ago just to sort of check what information we have that's new, and I would share a couple things about 1631. You know, the first is 2/3 of the people who voted yes were under the age of 30, based on exit polling. 50% of women supported, but the vast majority of votes that were against were from households with a median income of somewhere between $25,000 and $75,000. So the reality is that the tax number and the messaging problem that we faced, particularly for lower income households, was, I believe, probably a strategic error in the messaging choice that we adopted.
Okay. Do you have any other thoughts about why it lost?
I mean, listen, $30 million of money in advertising coming from the oil and gas sector. They basically outspent the campaign 3-1. So in a straight out fight of messaging, there's no way you're going to beat that. So I think we have to look much more deliberately at the techniques we use if we're going to go at the grassroots of ballot initiatives. I do believe that the power of the coalition that was pulled together is something that, if anybody here was supportive, thank you very much, is something that we can all be incredibly proud of. And you have to see this in the context of generations, not quarterly earnings or a year of political action.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that, and I'm thrilled. Congrats on not losing any members. You probably
well, I don't know about that, but not that I'm aware of. So.
So Kelly, let's turn to you, and can you talk a little bit about Levi's overall philosophy and values and how you approach, I mean, you have an unbelievable history, and by the way, thank you for being a founding member of the Series Bicep Network. You've been an incredible advocate on LGBT, on AIDS, on child labor, so many issues. Talk to us about your philosophy, how you take positions, and how that lines up with your values. And then if you would, walk us through a little bit about your new campaign around voting.
Yeah, so I think that this work of advocacy and corporate activism is very natural to us, and it's something that we've done for a very, very long time. So we can connect a dot all the way back to our founder, Levi Strauss. But even decade after decade after decade, we feel incredibly proud of our leaders' willingness to step up. One of our core values is courage, and really been willing to step up. And oftentimes what we find is that we've spoken up on issues before they have become, in the long run, they end up being on the right side of history. But we've opened the door and made it okay for other companies to follow us. And that's everything from being the first on the amicus brief for gay marriage to the work that we did on the terms of engagement 25 years ago. I mean, there's example after example after example of where we've gone first and others have followed. And so we've always been very core on equality, you mentioned this, and issues around communities that may be discriminated against, and around sustainability and environmental change. In the last couple of years, though, it's been really apparent that there were other places that it made sense for us to speak up. And when we think about those, you had asked Alex about what's the criteria or the process for making those choices, and we have a very detailed list of questions that we ask ourselves and that we make ourselves go through the discipline of asking those questions of what's the implications for our business. But the real core questions, and the ones that we stop on and spend time on, is whether or not it's consistent with our values. Is there pieces of the puzzle that just don't feel right to us, and therefore, and can we make a difference? Do we have something unique that we can offer to the conversation that's going to move it forward? And in the last couple of years, it's felt like our portfolio needed to expand, that there were issues that, particularly one of the pieces is we worry about being consistent with our values being authentic to our actions and that we're willing to really think about it holistically. And last and foremost, almost all of the big issues that we've taken have first generated with our employees saying, what are you going to do about this? And that has been more and more so in the past couple of years. And in fact, when I watch sort of the stories of employee activism that we're seeing at a lot of the tech companies and other things, it's actually been a permission for us. It's been the place that's been a North Star on where should we put energy and time. And so we stepped up on gun violence prevention, and we really were the first company that didn't really have a stake in that business to weigh in on it, and did it in a very broad scale way, and have been incredibly proud that that's one of the examples where other companies have followed since then. And we're starting to see more, not a lot, it's a hard issue to weigh in on, but we're starting to see more companies weigh in on that issue. We did it on immigration and some of the discriminatory policies that we saw coming forward and really weighing in. And again, that's an issue where we don't have a specific business interest in the way that some of the other parts of the coalition did, but it felt like the right thing to do, and it felt like a continuation of a conversation and advocacy that we've been doing on behalf of communities for a long time. And similarly, voting has been, everything kind of leads to voting is what we really learn. And the more that our employees say, how can I get involved and what can I do? The answer comes again and again and again to make sure that your voice is heard. And that is both consistent with what our brand purpose is around authentic self-expression. It's consistent with us using the bully pulpit of the CEO's office to say, how can you have an influence? At the end of the day, the thing that we can answer the question, and absolutely it's bipartisan, is we can make sure that people's voices are heard through voting. And so you asked about the campaign. What really happened is it was one of those beautiful moments that happen in companies. And I said this to Alex beforehand. If we had done it as a top-down initiative, it wouldn't have gotten nearly the traction that it got. But first and foremost, we partnered with, you were talking about Patagonia. Rose did an op-ed where she encouraged companies to really reflect on the fact that Election Day is not a holiday and that many employees don't have the opportunity to vote. And when we saw that and they sort of raised their hand and said, we're thinking about how do we make this bigger, we were very quick to step in and to galvanize. And ultimately, we got more than 400 companies to commit to the fact that they would make sure that their employees would have time to vote. And one of the things that we learned in that process, because we really focused on the retail industry in particular, and when you think about hourly employees, the first answer is how do we do that? And what we found is in many, many cases, companies already had policies in place. They just weren't necessarily communicating or acting on them. And so we're continuing to push forward and put that forward. What got interesting about that program, though, is Chip, our CEO, weighed in on the issue. We got another 400 companies to care about making sure that their employees got out. But then we started to bridge into our consumer communications as well. And so marketing did produce a television spot that they ran here in the US. It's run in other countries as well. In fact, it was running in South Africa last week. And then kind of what happened was every corner of the organization said, how can we help? And so we had voter registration in our stores. We had opportunities for employees. We changed our policy around volunteer hours. We give employees 5 hours a month to volunteer in any organization they like. We broadened the spectrum so that they could do that on behalf of political efforts and voter registration as well. And so it just became this dot connecting of, we had a t-shirt that was, became a very big influencer campaign for us. And so we just looked at, it wasn't that we said, what are all the things that we can ask each other to do? It was that within the organization, as the idea that felt so natural and so real to who we are, everyone started to galvanize around saying, hey, I can help, and I can help, and I can help. And in the culmination, it was an incredibly proud moment of what we were able to do. And I think we realized we're just getting started and going to work really hard to both bring other companies into that mix and also partner with all the folks who are interested in this issue and trying to continue to lean hard into it.
Yeah. That's fantastic. You gave me a great quote that you said Chip offers you, which is, let's always make sure we take the harder right over the easier wrong. What's he mean by that?
You know, I think that there are lots of times where there are choices where you can opt out or you can make a decision that that's not our issue, or there are times when there's just an easier decision, like there's a lower threshold to the decision, but it's not the right decision. It's not the right decision long term. It's not the right decision for our history and what we do for our constituencies that we care about. And so that has been a mantra from the very beginning. It's how he runs the business. It's how we make decisions about some of the things that you guys have been talking about around environmental commitments. And it's very much the decision of how we make decisions around advocacy. And so, you know, I mentioned sort of in passing gun violence prevention. That's a really harder right over the easier wrong. So there is every argument to say this is a hot button issue, it's not your issue, and there are a lot of gun owners who love their Levi's, and is that really the answer that you want to do? And what we did was we heard from our employees. You know, here in San Francisco, Chip will often say that you mentioned your daughter was 11. He has a 12-year-old daughter. And here in San Francisco, kids do more drills on an active shooter situation than on earthquakes. And that's sort of stunning to us as an organization. And it's an issue that so many young people care about. And as we watch sort of one of the things that we realize is a sweet spot for us in terms of advocacy is really putting the wind beneath the wings of youth movements. And when youth really speak up, how can we lend our voice to help give that the galvanizing factor that it makes sense? And so on gun violence, that was one where we started to see more and more voices, and you could almost see the corporate entities shifting away from the table. And so that felt one where we needed to lean in and say, how can we help? And we've learned a lot, and there's a long way to go.
Yeah, that's tremendous. Thank you so much. By the way, if you're interested in asking a question, you can go to the app for this session, and please register your question. We will try to get to them at the end. Those will be curated as best we can, given our time. So, John, the big issue is climate change. The big hard one. Gun control, by the way, is extremely difficult. But we're talking about climate change and climate advocacy. Why don't you share with us? I know you have some slides. Share with us, what are the big trends? What should REI and Levi's and folks in the room be thinking about in terms of American expectations for companies?
Sure. So we've been conducting these nationally representative surveys of the American population twice a year for about 10 years now. So I don't know.
Yep,
okay,
it's
it's
up.
up. So what you see in this slide here, this is from our most recent survey in December of 2018. We asked this question in all of our surveys. We basically want to know, do you want to see more action, more efforts from various sectors of society to address global warming? We ask about global warming in the surveys because that's what Americans the term that they tend to use more frequently than climate change. And what we see consistently across the years is that corporations and industry always comes out on top with the greatest proportion of Americans wanting to see more action from that sector of society. And that this spans across partisan lines, right? You'll notice that a majority of Republicans, especially moderate Republicans, want to see more action from corporations and industry. And when we look at consumer activism, we also see that greater proportions of Americans are likely to engage in some form of consumer activism compared to political activism. So here we ask people whether or not they've rewarded certain companies for taking steps to address global warming over the past year, as well as whether they've punished certain companies that are opposing steps to address global warming over the past year, including we also ask about whether or not they've contacted elected officials to urge them to take action on global warming. And what you see is that more or less a pretty consistent pattern over the years that companies are more likely to face pressure from the American population, more so than politicians are when it comes to taking action on climate change. And so some of you might be wondering, okay, well, so what might be the reaction if I take a position on this issue and make some sort of public commitment like Alex and Kelly have been talking about? And so we asked in our most recent survey to what extent people would be more or less likely to purchase goods and services from companies that make commitments to 100% clean renewable energy. And we see, as you can tell, a majority of Americans say they'd be more likely to purchase goods and services from companies that make such commitments. But I think what's really notable here in this slide is that when you look at the proportion of people who would say they'd be less likely to purchase from those companies, Very few Americans say they'd be less likely to. Even among conservative Republicans, you see that only 9% of them say they'd actually be less likely to purchase goods and services from companies that commit to 100% clean energy. And then obviously, one additional way that companies can get involved in this, aside from just greening their business operations, is by encouraging citizens to vote, right? Or encouraging them to actually get involved and contact their elected officials and urge them to take action on global warming. So this is from a couple of years ago, but we asked this question, we wanted to get a sense of what are the barriers keeping more Americans from engaging in contacting their elected officials. And as you can see, the top reason on here is simply they haven't been asked before. Nobody's ever asked me to do this, right? And so here's a key opportunity where companies can really reach out and make that request. And then several of these other things. It wouldn't make a difference. I don't know who to contact. I wouldn't know what to say. Again, these are sort of the roles that organizations can play to organize people and get them involved in this process. Another interesting one, the third one there, I'm not an activist, right? So I think companies in the private sector generally can really help address some of these long-standing stereotypical perceptions of what it means to be an environmental activist or a climate activist, and really change people's perception that you don't have to have long hair and be a hippie and wear sandals to be a climate change activist, right? That this can come from a variety of different backgrounds. So I'll go ahead and leave it there.
John, is it possible, we've been saying earlier that silence is not neutrality. Is that your sense? Is it possible for today's consumer to think of silence as being complicit, perhaps, if you're not speaking out? Is that a liability potentially?
Potentially. So we haven't asked, specifically, even the question about, whether you've punished certain companies. It's about whether or not you've punished companies who are actively opposing action to address global warming. So we don't know for certain about neutrality, but I think one key question is, people are probably more likely to face criticism for not making ambitious enough commitments or ambitious enough activities, as opposed to doing too little.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that this is a moment that it is extremely safe and wise for companies and CEOs to stand up, speak out, put it out there early and often, actively on climate change, as aggressively as possible. Did I get that right? Is that, that's what I heard. Is that what you heard?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the key trends that we see in our data is that, especially as of our December survey, we're seeing record high levels of Americans saying that climate change is happening, it's human caused, they're concerned about it. Half of Americans now say that people in the United States are being harmed right now. So less and less are we seeing this as an issue that's distant in the future, that it's a problem for plants, penguins, and polar bears, or small island nations in the Pacific, but that this is something happening here in my community right now that I'm concerned about. And that certainly, has put some wind in the sails in terms of...
all puns intended. Sure.
And do you mind if I just comment on that for a second? I just think the debate on this has to go beyond whether companies can say anything about, doing things that help the environment. This debate has been had. The question is what to say and what to do. When you have the global oil majors out publicly advocating for a tax on carbon, what more air cover are you looking for? So where I do think you could be incredibly helpful, and this is where the question of what to do becomes the language choices, going back to 1631, the mechanisms by which we introduce the conversation, so that indeed it isn't, and I think it's phenomenally depressing, some of the numbers that were on your previous slide, that it wouldn't make a difference. Like the branding of what it means to take action, such that this is in fact a civic duty, not an act of rebellious defiance in the face of civic responsibility. It in fact is the most powerful expression of civic responsibility, which is why I have so much respect for the work that Kelly Levi's and the consortium that supported that have done. That's a much more risky proposition, the work you did, than saying, hey, listen, let's take action to address global warming. So I'm in the zone of, like, go do it. The question is how.
Yeah, here. Thank you. I feel like you two have sort of softened the ground in many ways. I think I'm sensing resilience, that because you've weighed in, and you kind of alluded to this, that you've made the space for others to weigh in. And because you've weighed in before, it's going to be easier for you to weigh in again, and the next time, and the next time. Is that true? Is that your sense? That
Kelly.
Well, I would say that there's an expectation. So there's an expectation with your stakeholders, starting first and foremost at home with your employees, and then expanding from there. I think one bridge that's relevant to this group that's related to this is, we went public just a couple of months ago. And one of the big questions that we heard inside our doors is, will we change as a result of this? Will we compromise on our values? Will we do more easier, wrongs? And, our CEO and CFO, I think they did 600 meetings during the roadshow. And this question came up in almost every conversation. And what they said was, no, we're very public about who we are. Our consumers know what to expect from us, our employees know what to expect from us, and our supply chain knows what to expect from us, and we're going to be consistent on those fronts. That doesn't mean that everyone will choose to invest with us. That's okay. There's more than enough, and the performance of the company has proven that that wasn't a compromise at all. And I think more than anything, whether than I would call it resilience, I would think that it actually enhanced the loyalty to the company, both from, as you think of each of those groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe how fast this has gone, and we're going to do rapid fire now. From each of you, from where you sit, what are the primary recommendations you would give to this group? You have many companies in the room who might be thinking about stepping out, wanting to do it right. I know you've both talked about authenticity. Your recommendations at this point?
So I think the data that I showed is pretty clear that whether it's making a commitment to 100% clean energy or something else, Americans are very broadly supportive across party lines of clean energy generally. And even when you look at certain climate policies, whether it's increasing investments into renewable energy or even a carbon tax, there's broader support than normally we might assume when you actually look at the public opinion data. And so simply even just telling that story, correcting people's or underestimation of where support actually is, and can really help build that momentum. And I think companies stepping out and making those kinds of commitments only helps to reinforce and correct some of those underestimations of support.
Absolutely.
So I'd offer three things. I'd say for the investors in the room, ask the companies that you're following, where are they in these issues, and build an expectation that they're going to have great answers and that they're going to be proud of their answers on their issues. All that does is help to put influence inside our organization. So I would say that. For the corporates in the room, make sure that you're supporting your employees in voting, and if you want to learn more about that, we're very eager to expand that group, so happy to talk about that. But then secondly, as you ask yourself, I don't think that there's one playbook that makes sense around these types of corporate advocacy issues. I think first and foremost, and I said this before, but you start with what are the values, the principles that drive your company, and where does it make sense for you to play? What's authentic to you? I think that we didn't talk much about some of the examples that you flashed up, but I do think that part of the criticism was if there are one notes and there are one notes that come out of marketing, that's a hard story to say that it feels really authentic to who you are. And then last, I would say, get your inspiration from the people who are closest to you. And for us, that usually is our employees.
Yeah, great, thank you. Alex?
I don't know what to share. I think that the hard question, if you've got an organization that isn't willing to move, is how do you get in the head of the leader? And you've got to find that person at a place of vulnerability, not in a threatening manner, but and you got to spend time trying to understand that individual, because in all of these examples that you can look at, leadership really matters. And the moment you help somebody who's leading a large enterprise and they're concerned for the future of employment for everybody who's in it, the moment you can give them the protection that, in fact, doing this work isn't, in fact, about whether someone is going to buy from you or not.
Right.
I think, in my experience, that's when the window of opportunity emerges, and it nearly always comes from a place of heart, not head. In my experience, that may not be true for for everybody in this room. So I think you have to also just take a really deep relationship, like put the relationship lens on this and explore the person who may be, who may be the biggest possible catalyst.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to your leadership going forward. We look forward to your new findings. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. Please join me in thanking our panel today.